Picture this. It's January 1317, somewhere in rural England. A father opens the door of his cottage and looks out at a field he can't see the edge of. The snow has been falling for 3 days. His youngest child has a fever. His wife is rationing the last of the salted pork. The grain store is down to maybe 2 weeks of flour if they stretch it. The nearest village is 6 miles away through drifts that reach his waist. He shuts the door, sits down, and starts calculating. Not panicking, calculating. Because he has done this before. His father did it, his father's father did it. Surviving a medieval winter wasn't luck. It was a system, built over centuries, refined through failure and death and the hard knowledge of what actually works when everything outside is trying to kill you. So how did they actually do it? Medieval people didn't get surprised by winter. They feared it from the moment spring arrived. The entire agricultural year was structured around one question. Do we have enough stored to survive until the next harvest? Every month between planting and September was a countdown, and September itself was close to a referendum on whether your family would still be intact by April. A good harvest meant full grain stores, enough preserved meat to last 5 months, hay stockpiled for the animals, and firewood stacked before the first frost. A bad harvest meant the opposite of all of those things at the same time. What most people don't picture when they hear bad harvest is the actual timeline of how it killed you. It wasn't immediate. You didn't starve in October, you made it to November, December, January, and then somewhere around February or March, when the stores ran out and the new crops were still 6 weeks from being ready, that's when people started dying. That stretch became so well known it had a name: the Hunger Gap. We'll come back to that. The other thing medieval people had that we completely underestimate was pattern recognition. They didn't have weather forecasts, but they had centuries of accumulated observation passed down through communities. A ring around the moon meant moisture coming. Certain wind directions in October predicted the severity of the winter ahead. The behavior of animals before a storm, the thickness of onion skins. None of it was perfect, but it wasn't superstition either. It was generations of people paying close attention to the same environment and teaching their children what they noticed. When the first hard frost arrived, usually October or November, depending on the region, the calculation shifted from "Are we prepared?" to "What do we do with what we have?" The planning phase was over. The survival phase had begun. The house a medieval peasant family lived in looked nothing like what most people imagine. No separate rooms, no insulation in the walls, no glass in the windows, often no chimney. And in most of rural Europe, the family shared their living space with their livestock. That last part sounds primitive. It was actually one of the smartest decisions in the entire medieval survival system. A single cow produces roughly the same amount of body heat as a small electric heater running continuously. 2 pigs together produce more. In a longhouse design where animals occupied one end and the family occupied the other, separated by a low partition, the combined body heat of the animals could raise the indoor temperature by 6 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit compared to outside. In a winter where outdoor temperatures regularly dropped below freezing, that difference was the line between surviving the night and not. The smell was significant. Medieval sources from the period reference it with some regularity. But nobody who lived through a northern European winter in the 13th century complained about it. You don't complain about warmth when warmth is keeping your children alive. The construction of the house itself was more sophisticated than it looks. Thatch roofing, which most people dismiss as primitive, is actually a remarkably effective insulator. A well-laid thatch roof, 12 to 18 inches thick, retains heat comparably to modern insulated roofing materials. It also sheds water quickly and handles snow load without collapsing under moderate conditions. The walls were wattle and daub in most cases, a woven framework of branches packed with a mixture of clay, straw, animal dung, and sometimes sand. It sounds fragile. It wasn't. the straw and organic material the mixture created natural insulating pockets. The earthen floor helped regulate temperature by holding warmth absorbed during the day and releasing it slowly overnight. Windows were covered with wooden shutters, sometimes oiled cloth, almost never glass unless you were wealthy. Keeping them closed meant losing light. Opening them meant losing heat. Most families chose heat. The interior of a medieval winter home was dark. It was often smoky. The fire burned in the center of the room in many regions, with a hole in the roof above it and no chimney to direct the smoke. The smoke filled the upper portion of the room before slowly escaping. This was not entirely accidental. Smoke in the thatch killed parasites and helped preserve the roof material. The family stayed low where the air was cleaner, which also happened to be where the heat pooled. Privacy was irrelevant. Personal space was irrelevant. The entire family slept together, usually in the same bed or on straw pallets clustered near the fire. Body heat was not wasted. Every warm body in the room was a resource. Here is the thing about medieval winter food that most people get completely wrong. The goal was not to eat well. The goal was to still be eating anything at all by April. Those are very different objectives, and the strategies they required were completely different from how we think about food today. Salt was the closest thing medieval communities had to a superpower. Salting meat pulled moisture out of it, creating an environment where the bacteria that caused decay couldn't survive. A properly salted side of pork, stored in a cool, dry location, could last through an entire winter. It wouldn't taste good. It would be tough, intensely salty and nutritionally limited. But it would be food, which by February was the only standard that mattered. Smoking accomplished something similar through a different mechanism. The compounds in smoke killed surface bacteria and dried the outer layer of the meat, slowing internal decay. Smoked fish, particularly herring, became a staple of Northern European winter diets precisely because it was cheap to catch, easy to smoke, and would last for months if kept dry. Fermentation was the third pillar. Sauerkraut, fermented turnips, pickled vegetables. The acids produced by fermentation inhibited bacterial growth in the same way salt did, but with the added benefit that fermented foods actually developed certain nutrients during the process. Medieval people didn't know the science of it, but they knew it worked. The primary food of a medieval peasant in winter was pottage. This was essentially a thick stew made from whatever was available: dried beans, barley, turnips, leeks if they had them. A small amount of preserved meat or fat for flavor. It was cooked in a single pot over the fire and eaten from shared bowls. It was monotonous beyond anything most modern people have experienced, but it was calorie-dense, warm, and it kept families functional. Now, here's where it gets genuinely dangerous. By February, even families who had prepared well were starting to feel the math working against them. The stores that had looked adequate in October were visibly diminishing. The grain was stretched further and further with water and chaff. The salted meat was nearly gone. The root vegetables in the cellar were soft and sprouting, and the new crops were nowhere near ready. The ground was still frozen or sodden. Planting was 6 weeks away at minimum. Harvest was 6 months away. This was the hunger gap. It peaked in March. It killed the very young and the very old. It weakened everyone else. There are accounts in medieval church records of entire communities subsisting on boiled grass, bark bread, and whatever could be foraged under snow. The fact that people survived it at all is a testament to how carefully the preceding months had been managed. The deliberate culling of livestock before winter needs to be understood in this context. When a family slaughtered most of their pigs in November, they weren't being reckless. They were making a calculated decision. Pigs that couldn't be fed through the winter would consume food resources the family needed for themselves. Better to salt the meat now and eat it over 5 months than watch the animals starve while the grain supply drained away feeding it. They kept what they could feed. They preserved everything they couldn't, and they were rarely wrong in that calculation, because being wrong meant your family didn't make it to spring. Wool is not just fabric. It is, in the context of pre-industrial winter survival, one of the most effective thermal management technologies ever developed. Understanding why changes how you see everything about medieval cold weather survival. Wool insulates when wet. Cotton and linen lose almost all their insulating properties when soaked. Wool retains somewhere between 70 and 80% of its insulating value, even when completely saturated. In a world without waterproof outerwear, where anyone who stepped outside in a snowstorm was going to get wet, that property was not a minor advantage. It was the difference between being functional outside and being incapacitated by cold. Medieval people understood this intuitively, even without the science. Wealthy families invested in thick woolen outer garments. Peasants often had only one outer garment, a rough woolen cloak or mantle, but they maintained it carefully because replacing it was difficult. They also layered. Multiple thinner layers trap more air between them than one thick layer, creating better insulation through the same principle that makes modern base layer systems work. Nobility had fur-lined garments and access to fine wool. Peasants had coarser wool and less of it. But even rough wool significantly outperformed nothing, and nothing was the alternative. The fireplace problem is something most people don't think about, but it was a persistent challenge for medieval homes. An open hearth in the center of a room is thermally inefficient. A significant percentage of the heat produced goes directly up and out. The walls around the fire absorb heat slowly and radiate it back, but not efficiently enough to make up for what's lost. Medieval families solved this not with better technology, but with better positioning. You clustered as close to the fire as tolerable. You slept near it. You worked near it. You wasted no heat through distance from the source. The other techniques were simple but effective. Stones placed near the fire for several hours would retain significant heat for 2 to 3 hours after removal. Wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of a bed or under the covers, they could keep a sleeping area warm through the early hours of the night. Bed curtains on a box bed design created a small enclosed space that body heat could maintain at a survivable temperature, even while the rest of the room cooled. None of this was comfortable by any modern standard. All of it worked. Here is the part of medieval winter survival that gets the least attention and matters the most. Individual families did not survive in isolation. The village was the unit of survival, and the systems that held the village together during winter were as carefully constructed as anything physical. Grain management in many medieval communities was at least partially collective. The Lord's granary held reserves that were theoretically available to the community in extreme situations. Monasteries and church institutions operated as significant food distribution networks during famines, providing what they called alms, essentially emergency food distribution to the destitute. This wasn't charity in the modern sense. It was a socially enforced obligation. A monastery that failed to provide relief during a famine faced serious consequences to its local reputation and relationships. The church had made winter survival partly its institutional responsibility, and that infrastructure mattered enormously. At the neighbor level, the obligations were less formal but just as real. Medieval peasant communities operated on a system of mutual dependency that modern individualism makes it difficult to fully appreciate. You helped your neighbor repair his roof before winter because in a bad winter you might need him to share his grain. You shared labor during the harvest because isolated families couldn't harvest fast enough before rain or frost arrived. The entire social structure of a peasant community was built around the understanding that surviving hard winters required pooling resources and labor. This extended to heat. Communal fires in village meeting places or church buildings provided warmth for the very poorest, those who had no adequate fuel or shelter of their own. Not because it was pleasant to share a fire with strangers, but because the community understood that people dying of cold in one part of the village was a problem for everyone. What happened to those without community is the difficult part of this picture. Isolated homesteads without village connections had significantly higher mortality rates in severe winters. Travelers caught between settlements regularly died. Outcasts and those excluded from village social systems had almost no safety net. The brutal underside of the medieval communal survival system was that it only extended to those the community recognized as members. If you were inside the network, it could carry you through almost anything. If you were outside it, a severe winter could simply end you. Not everyone made it. That needs to be said directly. Medieval winter mortality was real and significant, and it was not distributed equally. Understanding who died and why tells you as much about the system as understanding who survived. Children under 5 and adults over 50 were disproportionately represented in winter mortality figures. Children's immune systems were still developing. Their caloric needs relative to their body weight were higher. Their ability to generate and retain body heat was lower. A respiratory infection that a healthy adult weathered in a week could kill a 2-year-old in a medieval cottage in 2 days. The elderly had the opposite problem. Their ability to generate body heat declined. Their caloric needs were lower, which meant they were often the ones who voluntarily ate less when stores were running out. Families talk about it in historical records with a matter-of-fact quality that is striking. The old ate last and least, because that was the calculation that gave the most people the best chance of surviving. There is a specific period in European history that serves as the clearest picture of what happens when the medieval winter survival system fails at scale. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. It began with an agricultural catastrophe. The summer of 1315 was exceptionally wet across northern Europe. The harvest failed on a continental scale. The grain stores that medieval communities depended on simply didn't exist in the necessary quantities. The following winter was severe. Then the following summer failed again. And again. For 7 consecutive years, harvests across England, France, Germany and the Low Countries ranged from poor to catastrophic. Estimates suggest that between 10 and 25% of the population of Northern Europe died during this period. Some urban areas saw higher rates. The survival systems that worked in a bad winter, the grain stores, the salted meat, the community networks, all of them were overwhelmed by the sheer duration of the crisis. By the 3rd year, there was nothing left to redistribute, nothing to share, no reserves to draw on. People ate cats, they ate dogs, they ate seed grain that should have been kept for planting, which guaranteed the following year's harvest would also fail. Contemporary accounts describe parents abandoning children and children abandoned by parents on roads. The social fabric of community survival, which was so effective in a single bad winter, fractured under the sustained pressure of something that lasted 7 years. And yet, the population of Europe recovered. The communities rebuilt. The systems were repaired and reinforced, because the knowledge of how to survive a bad winter was not lost. It was carried in the people who made it through. What a normal survival winter looked like was very different. Families emerged in April thinner, weaker, but alive. The children who made it through their first 5 winters in a medieval community were remarkably resilient. The adults who managed the entire system, who made the calculations about slaughter and salt, and stored grain and neighbor obligations, had developed a form of operational competence around survival that was genuinely sophisticated. They didn't have central heating. They didn't have refrigeration. They didn't have weather forecasting or supply chains or emergency services. What they had was knowledge, community, and a system that had been tested to destruction and rebuilt many times over centuries. The average medieval peasant knew things about thermal management, food preservation, resource rationing, and communal dependency that most modern people have entirely lost. Not because modern people are less capable, but because modern infrastructure has made those skills unnecessary. We have systems that do the survival work for us, invisibly, constantly, without our participation or understanding. The question worth sitting with is a simple one. Those systems that do the work for us, what happens if they stop? Because the father, standing at his cottage door in January 1317, looking at a field disappearing under 3 days of snow, calculating with his 2 weeks of flour and his sick child and his neighbors 6 miles away. He had an answer. He had built one over a lifetime, and so had his father before him and his community around him. He shut the door, sat down, and began to work the problem. The reason medieval winter survival is worth understanding isn't nostalgia. It isn't admiration for a harder time. It's because the principles that kept families alive across 5 centuries of European winters, preparation over panic, community over isolation, knowledge over improvisation, haven't actually been replaced by anything. They've just been made temporarily unnecessary by modern infrastructure. Those principles are still the right ones. The medieval families who survived knew that before any of us were born. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the video on screen covers something in the same vein. Give it a watch and subscribe if you haven't.